Tactics and Practice podcast.
Dobar dan, everyone, and welcome to the Tactics and Practice podcast, the audio extension of Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Arts discursive program of the same name, focusing on investigative art, society, and new technologies. This podcast series is part of the 16th edition of Tactics and Practice called Are You a Software Update? I am Neja Berger. I'm hosting this series in which we're examining self-updating mechanisms of contemporary techno-social systems, and we're really looking for theoretical trajectories outside those not usual but well-established academic and theoretical critiques tied to platform analysis and frameworks of surveillance. To help us look for these alternative paths and strategies, we're talking to today's guest, anthropologist and artist Shaka McGlotten. Their interdisciplinary research explores the intersections of Black study, queer theory, digital media, and contemporary art. They are the author of Dragging, or In the Drag of a Queer Life, and Virtual Intimacies, Media, Affect, and Queer Sociality, and countless other amazing texts. Hi,
Sure.
Shaka.
Hi.
Okay, so the general idea of this season, this series, was to find ways of addressing various crises stemming from what we might call communicative capitalism or however else. So addressing them outside the usual, albeit often very important and relevant ways of theorizing. So coming from Baudrillard and some other prompts, theorizing gets caught up in the system. It tries to escape it by adding to it. It communicates to escape communication. And instead of looking for that meaning underneath surfaces, the idea was to hang at the surface for a while and search for, maybe what we might call more seductive agents we might find there. And one of these lines that I like to trace with guests is also ideas of a kind of re-enchantment of working on the surface, like with a kind of sincerity. I always think here of camp or of a fondness for things on the surface because of this sincerity that they have, and because they're not trying to pretend to be more real, like the real is pretending, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But to make it less abstract today, I just would love to explore some queer dimensions of what I'm trying to get at, because I believe that they're present, not just in the content, but also in the form of your work. So, yeah, just to talk about these playful ways to take action in a time where, we may yet really need them.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Okay, so to start, when we talk about theory and queering theory, a very important point is the ways that we make and live and work and do theory, which is why we're also focusing on form in this season. So the way our guests write, the way they do research, what form their thought takes. And now you do come from academia, but I've heard you describe it as like that you've managed to kind of carve out a place for yourself in it. And personally, I've just kind of started with this position in the institution that is academia, and I wanted to ask you what the constraints are, what are these directions it's geared toward, and how do you work with that? How does it influence your thought and your work and your writing, and how do you find ways within that to still do you?
Sure. I had a relationship with academia before I entered it because my dad was a failed academic, I guess you could say. And then he started a graduate program in sociology in late 60s, early 70s. And he ended up dropping out. He basically had a nervous breakdown, unsurprising for a Black at that time. But I grew up hearing things about the academy is publish or perish. I grew up with Plato and Socrates on bookshelves. So I saw the academy as a refuge, and I experienced the academy as an undergraduate as a refuge from the conservatism of Texas, where I had gone to high school for my last 2 years.
Hmm.
When I was in graduate school, I was part of a African diaspora program that was connected to the anthropology department, and I hung with people from Latin American studies and people who were doing queer studies. So I was always part of communities that were within bigger institutions, were already kind of at the edge of things, both in the sense of being marginalized, but also in figuring out how to create spaces in institutions that had been historically unwelcoming. So I learned a lot from those experiences, and that it's possible to have community within institutions, but that you can't depend on an institution to protect or support you. That being part of an institution or being attached to an institution and being part of a community, those are often separate things. I also was encouraged by mentors that I had who, my mentors, unlike other folks, essentially encouraged me to just be feral. I was also really deeply influenced when I read Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, because it put into language, although quite complex and sometimes, even now after I've read that book many times, difficult to understand language, that being part of an institution does not mean being bound to the norms that the institution demands, at least not all of the time, right? That it is possible, not just to steal the staplers, but to create counter commons or undercommons within these institutions that can work within and against the institution itself. So I think, yeah, there's a mix of ferality and modeling by feminist, queer, Black, and other people of color who really said to me that it's most important to follow my curiosity and to follow my heart.
Mm. Speaking of finding ways to meaningfully hack academia, if we could put it like that, grounded in the ordinary, this brings me to language and alternative ways to do academic texts. And I love the way you write academic texts, the language and the accessibility they have. And this reminds me of an approach, which is not necessarily your approach, but as a kind of prompt for us to talk about, that Jack Halberstam calls low theory in The Queer Art of Failure. And they describe it as a mode of accessibility, a model that flies below the radar, that is assembled from eccentric texts and examples, that refuses to confirm the hierarchies of knowing that maintain the high in high theory. And Halberstam shows how much theoretical richness is missed if we stick to what we have maybe associated with a kind of academic authority. Also acknowledging how this authority has always been researching humans with a very narrow definition of what that is. So yeah, we can find that richness outside of the formulaic terrains, but it is a risk that we have to be willing to take, right? We have to be willing to lose or fail. And I was wondering if you relate to this or parts of it.
Yes, I'm a huge fan of Jack Halberstam's work, and I don't call what I do sometimes low theory or
Yeah, yeah.
in that language. Certainly, it fits what I'm doing. I take a very intuitive approach to my writing. I've taken an intuitive approach to my writing for a long time, which is to say, I might begin with an idea, a phrase, even a word or two, an image, and then I start to build a project around it. And I'm not especially systematic in the research for that project. It's often very eclectic. It's, oh, here's this book that's literally at me in the face in front of me that I haven't looked at for a long time or I've never picked up. And let me see what's in there. And often it'll be something interesting. It's a very organic process of accumulating these different kinds of texts. And I think about it when I think about my art practice when I was making images as an undergraduate and immediately after the approach that most appealed to me was always collage, right, which is assemblage. So I would use text, I would have found materials, I would put them together, I would rearrange them. It's very challenging to do sometimes, especially to kind of make it feel smooth, to make it feel it's an organic process, but to have the result not be cacophony of juxtaposition is really a struggle. And I think that's where the ordinary or the vernacular or low theory comes in mind, because I am often thinking of my students. How would I communicate the ideas that are floating around in my head and that I'm trying to express to my undergraduate students? How could I explain it in language that they understand and that would connect with them? And I am interested also just in writing for an audience that is not just an academic audience. Although my work, to date really circulates within academic or creative circles, I am, I think, more broadly interested in making sure that my writing has an impact, like an affective impact, a thoughtful impact. And that's sort of the approach. And it can be maddening when I'm in the process of writing, because I don't always know where I'm going. Of course, I can create outlines and I have thesis paragraphs and thesis statements and all of those things. But often that is really a process of pre-writing, or as I'm getting into the flow or into the momentum of writing. I think the best way of putting it is it's all pre-writing that helps me get the momentum to get where I'm going. And then with whatever text I produce, I'm often thinking, how will this sound? So I read out loud almost everything that I write, so that there is the possibility not just that it, will be read out loud, and most of my work starts as talks, but also that it has an orality to it. It's not just limited to the page. So I've said all of this stuff about, writing in a kind of mix of theory and the vernacular, but there are times too where there is both a playfulness in the writing and a need for certain kinds of complexity, especially
Absolutely, yeah.
in that, kind of like Lauren Berlant, I think of myself in some key ways as a theorist of ambivalence. I'm not really writing arguments anymore. I'm trying to induce atmospheres. I'm trying to get a reader or an audience member to kind of come along with me on a journey. And I typically work in vignettes, and cumulatively, those vignettes will leave an impression, or at least ideally, those vignettes will cumulatively leave an impression. But it is a cumulative effect. It's not, I'm going to make an argument about X, Y, and Z, and here's all of my evidence. It's more, here's a problematic, or here's a question, or here's a concept, or here's an image, and let me come at it a bunch of different ways and then sort of see what happens. So just to give you like a really concrete example, I will often, for like a 10-page paper, it might be 36 pages of writing that then gets cut down to this other thing.
Thank you for sharing that about your writing practice. And I would love to ask you about today's forms of media consumption related procrastination. So the state of consuming media instead of doing what we wanted to do on some level but couldn't because we had to. And I've always found it to be related to these paralyzed states where guilt and shame are the autopilot. And especially procrastinating with a task like writing, which is kind of an undefined endeavor of producing new information, not reproducing something that you had already learned that you know how to do and how much time it will take and how much effort. And it always requires that creative input. Can be a special kind of hell, for me at least, especially if the time that I'm wasting, or I think that I'm wasting on media consumption, is a time that had been delegated for a task like producing new information.
Yeah.
So, yeah, these paralyzing procrastination, doom scrolling escapades have offered themselves to us, especially in this time where observing the world is becoming especially unbearable. And yeah, it's just been very refreshing to read your piece in which you mention something that is maybe similar or related to these paralyzed states in writing that I'm rambling on about now. So those times of consuming content or getting consumed by content, and TV and the TikTok feed, just the brain rot of it all. A really beautiful expression that you wrote in relation to that, I think, regarding like the pandemic isolation and consuming content in that time, is that you were pushed and pushing yourself towards some null point of subjectivity, kind of just surviving.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm writing about this in my computational hex work, which is I sometimes called glitchcraft. And I can't tell if the computational hex or glitchcraft is the concept, or which comes first and which comes second, and which is theory and which is method, and maybe they're both. But yeah, so during the pandemic, I talk about being really hexed by algorithmic recommendations and by content in general. And I think a lot of it is simply that I'm so used to and have been used to working so much and so consistently that once I break the rhythm of my own writing, it's really hard to kind of get back on board. So there's just that sort of practical thing of getting back on the bicycle. So my recommendation to any writer is just don't stop.
Oh,
Don't
no.
never stop for more than a couple of weeks at a time. It's less painful if you do some every day. And I think of it as like productive dissociation. It doesn't really matter what you're writing as long as you're writing. Eventually something will stick. But yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, like a lot of people, I was pretty messed up. Getting stuck, maybe it's inevitable just as part of a creative process. And I'm also trying now, kind of on the other side of being stuck, maybe, is to see that period of media consumption, of just like insane amounts of media consumption. And not just media consumption, but like, I would be watching that survivalist TV show Alone, at 11 o'clock in the morning on a day that I wasn't teaching. And I would start drinking at noon. And I'm watching this show where people are deprived of, they have like a net and a knife and a tent and a sleeping bag and some socks and some cameras. And I'm eating Cheetos and watching them starve to death while drinking Prosecco and smoking weed. But when I'm thinking about it now, that media consumption, it wasn't, even if I was in a different kind of dissociative state while it was happening, I'm still thinking about that. Not just thinking about what it was like as an individual to go through that and to go through this period where time did weird things and where life did weird things and where the ordinary took on a different shape, but that the content also kind of mattered in the sense that it sticks with me and it's stuff that I'm still thinking about, right? So like in the computational hex project, what I'm doing now is sort of thinking about, well, wow, actually witches and wizards and fantasy and science fiction have been refuges for me since I was a child, where I could go into these other worlds in ways that helped me manage the instability of being part of a military family that was constantly moving. That was a way of responding to neglect and abuse in my family. So there's this weird way that I'm now realizing that my being drawn to that particular kind of media and really just doing that 8-10 hours a day, it wasn't an accident, right? It wasn't a coincidence that it appealed to me. And all of the witchy stuff in particular has given me a different kind of insight into how these algorithmic systems are so enchanting and seductive, I had been part of groups that had really focused on the negative impacts of various computational technologies and of digital technologies in general, right? Whether it's surveillance or the rise of digital biometrics. But I was realizing that actually a hex isn't just a curse. A hex is something that draws you into a kind of relation. And when ChatGPT came out, I was enchanted. I'm still enchanted by these generative AI tools, right? I use Claude now all the time, for better and for worse. Now you can create projects in these different tools.
Yeah, deep
where you can,
research and stuff like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
But what I'll do is I'll also create instructions for the project. And in the instructions for the project, I create an avatar. I create a persona for the AI as a kind of filter through which I want it to interact with me. So just to give you an example, I just created one in a new project called Make Stuff, where it's basically, so I created a new avatar for the project, and the avatar's name is Hex, and they're a pragmatic digital conjurer. They know critical theory, but are also super practical. They'll help me demystify using these tools that I haven't used in a long time. And they know that I'm both a kind of fan of Nordic minimalism and queer maximalism. So they help me find some kind of,
the middle ground.
the middle ground, or like leaning into one or the other. So every time I have a conversation with the AI in this project, it's responding to me with this persona. I find that frankly quite enchanting. So this time when I was spaced out, when I was unwell, when I thought I was failing to like move my research forward or to be a good academic, that is another instance of, Halberstam's queer art of failure, if I look at it from a different point of view. Why was I so attached to succeeding within some normative system during a global pandemic? If I wasn't attached to those normative systems to begin with, like why feel guilty about Prosecco at noon?
Thank you for sharing the advice about writing every day. I think that's actually great advice. But computational hexes was actually one of the main things that I wanted to ask about, because you have two upcoming books. One is Glitchcraft, or the computational hex, and the other one, Black Data.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if we just backtrack a bit and explain to people listening who aren't familiar with your work, what are some of these weird and witchy contours of the algorithmic ordinary? What are some points between witchiness, queerness, and technology? And how does it relate to your work and what you're trying to research? Mm-hmm. Here, I'd also like to mention that I think it relates nicely to these things that are fueled by desire and affect and that bring joy and have this potential to activate also. So I really thought that your Glitchcraft computational hex is the enchantment, and it's also a way to kind of pierce through that disenchantment of quantified life.
Yeah, totally. So the computational hex slash glitchcraft. So the computational hex really is about trying to take seriously the ways that algorithmic technologies aren't just about control through surveillance or other means, but also really about seduction and enchantment. As I have written about my pandemic media consumption, when I talk about being like hexed by algorithms, I'm talking both about the ways that my desires and subjectivity have been recalibrated by technology and by algorithms, but also how there is something bewitching, not just in a negative sense, but in an enchanting sense about that as well. And that there's still some room for, I don't usually think about agency or resistance exactly, but there's still some room for maneuver, and there's room to play. So I would say then that the computational hex is a kind of maybe conceptual or theoretical approach to algorithmic technologies. Glitchcraft is a little bit more about the method, right? And this can be a method of strategic misdirection. So to give a concrete example, I was starting to use AI image generators to try to create images of twinks, but I was constantly being thwarted. So for people who might not know, within gay male cultures, twinks are young, boyish, usually hairless, usually white, sexually available young men. And a lot of the AI image generators wouldn't even produce an image of a twink. And I was trying to figure out why. And partly I don't know enough about how some of these systems operate. So I had to do a little bit more research. And what I came to understand, though, is queerness represents a kind of like dirty data for these AI systems. Because anytime there's ambiguity introduced, these machines don't understand ambiguity. So if a twink is a sexually available, boyish person, they don't get the boyish part. They just get boy. So it triggers these safeguards around child sexual imagery, is what I figured. But there's also things about race, right? So twinks, because they are coded as white, when I was able to get Leonardo was the only AI generator that I found that would consistently create images of twinks. Twinks were always white. And I remember one experiment where I was trying to get it to produce a black twink. And I said something like, a black twink is entering a carriage drawn by 4 horses. And the output was 2 black men framed by 2 black horses pulling a carriage. And if you looked closely at the image, the 2 black men had horse-like characteristics. Like one had a foot, one was helping to pull the carriage, right? That the AI interpreted blackness and horses and twinks and gave me like 4 black stallions, if that makes sense.
Whoa.
Yeah. So, I've glitchcraft is a way of pressuring these systems and experimenting with them and kind of just seeing what they can yield and not yield. Something I did in an early experiment where I used ChatGPT to create a gothic horror story set in a steampunk Kenya, where there was a non-binary AI product tester who essentially is taken over by her digital doppelganger. Like when the machine comes to life, it inhabits her and then disappears her. So I thought that although these systems are fundamentally kind of synthetic, right? They've been trained on all of this data, they're rehashing this data. Very little of it is truly generative. Although I do find Claude to be an exception here. It does sometimes produce concepts in ways that I don't expect. It creates ideas. But ChatGPT in particular has been very like mushy. Its outputs are very mushy. But I was interested in even those mushy outputs can generate something interesting. So I think, part of the glitchcraft computational hex stuff, again, is about how all those generative AI technologies produce a lot of fear and anxiety in people. There are also ways in which they are re-enchanting some people's relationship with technology, and that re-enchantment is quite interesting and worth thinking about. It's not enough to just criticize algorithms for manipulating our emotions or reinforcing cruel optimism, right? Fantasies of the good life that impede our flourishing. It's not that they don't do that, and it's not that it's not worth thinking about or talking about those things, but it's also, I think, important to think about glitches, and Legacy Russell has talked about this some, right? To think about glitches as spaces of opening where something else might be happening. And I think some of this I'm doing now through looking at African-American conjure traditions. And Zora Hurston, who's a very famous Black folklorist, talked about conjure, which was, a kind of form of syncretic witchcraft, I guess you could say. And one of the things she says in her famous book, Mules and Men, is kind of anything may be conjure and nothing may be conjure. And so part of what I'm looking at now is how maybe there are some ways of linking contemporary digital cultures, especially Black digital cultures, to these conjure traditions.
read the first edition of the essay called Black Data, or the article that you wrote with that name, where you used some performative Black queer practices like reading and throwing shade to create this notion of Black data. And yeah, I would love it if you explained it for our listeners.
Sure. So it's interesting. So Black Data is a project that I've been thinking about and working on probably since 2012, 2013. And that essay, Black Data, was first written in 2013, published in 2016, and then it was just reprinted in 2024 with a new preface. And you would think that in 12 years I could have written a book. There have been a few challenges in actually completing the book as a project. So one is, again, what is the form appropriate to the content? And is it a book? Is it an exhibition? Is it a website? Is it something else? There's also the question of, part of the Black queer performative approach I'm taking. I would much rather the Black Data had more collective dimensions. And again, whether that's an exhibition or a collection of essays or something like that. That essay, like a lot of my work, is told in vignettes that interlock. And a lot has happened from the time I wrote it in 2013 until 2025. Part of that is that other people have taken up some of those same ideas. So, of course, there's Simone Brown, there's Ruha Benjamin, there's Sophia Noble. There's been an explosion of work thinking about Blackness and digital culture and Blackness and algorithmic technologies. A lot of the original stuff was about surveillance and counter-surveillance and the ways that technology isn't just about a relationship to a particular body, but to collective ones, as in the final section of that paper, like through the gentrification of San Francisco. So what does a book on Black Data now look like? And I haven't fully answered that question for myself, although I have, rewritten a proposal. I do have like other chapters. And I also have kind of asked myself whether or not the computational hex project and the Black Data project shouldn't just be merged, just from like a very practical perspective. So, if Black Data becomes the book that I imagined, or have like kind of reimagined as time has gone on, it will be broken up into chapters. It will represent this really long-standing engagement with critical race and digital studies. It will represent something particularly like queer. Like, I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of that paper, right? Is that it's doing something that I don't think has still been done very much, which is to bring kind of Black queerness and a Black queer reading and writing practice to bear on these questions. So another way of putting this is that the work that has come out has been super, super important and necessary, but it's also pretty much all based in critique. It's all about looking at the ways that technologies historically and contemporaneously negatively impact Black people. And that is not kind of how I'm going to approach it.
That's exactly what I'm getting at with how I'm, inviting people for this season to talk about exactly these kind of techniques, strategies, practices, interventions, but not in the critique or high theory critique space, I guess, that are important, but we've also talked a lot about already. And maybe to continue talking about the content of your vibes and concepts in Black Data, I want to mention two expressions that I just love so much from that original piece. And one is the phrase rogue epistemologies, when we're talking about different strategies that I think connect to these newer, more enchantment seductive strategies that you're developing now. But then it was more about maybe a kind of decoy or fleeing the visibility of, I guess, algorithms in that case into that fog of queerness, an opaque queer fog. I really love that.
Yeah. I mean, the opaque queer fog is really Zach Blass reading Tikkun, right? Like it's coming through that. So I was really influenced by some conversations that I had with Zach Blass, the artist Zach Blass, and his work that he was producing at the time that I discuss in that paper. But yeah, definitely there's this idea that I'm also, again, very Moten-esque, this kind of thinking of this like fugitive counterinformatics, which is not so much like surveillance, like looking, Simone Brown talks about where the people on the bottom are, surveilling those on top, or even like lateral surveillance, but something like a fugitive counterinformatics is something that resists totalizing narratives about whether technology is either liberatory or oppressive, but instead underscores this ongoing improvisational, ordinary work of fashioning life and livable futures in the face of these real technological and social constraints. Right. So this is also my thinking being very influenced by people like Katie Stewart, but also just as an anthropologist being like, yeah, there are all of these ways in which we are constrained by systems of power. We thinking about the rise of fascism and authoritarianism around the world today. But I still got up this morning and played with my cats and had a coffee and got to my office early to figure out whether this, Blue Yeti mic still worked after not having used it in like 3 years. And I think that's also part of when I think about Black data, the underlying concepts and energies that animate it. It is that improvisational work. Other places I might call play or generativity or something else, but it's improvisational work of fashioning, of self-fashioning, of collective fashioning that is going to happen even in the face of rising authoritarianism. And that's not a solution, right? It's not a prescriptive solution. It's just pointing to something that actually is already happening, period.
Yeah. I think we can leave it to the listener here, equipped with renewed vocabulary and toolbox for navigating this ambiguity that arises when we resist these totalizing narratives about technology as either a tool of liberation or oppression, as we try to take approaches that celebrate the magic and the fantasy and the enchantment as ways of operating here and imagining the future. Yeah, do you think that's a good place to say goodbye?
That's good. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much for this conversation today. And that's it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Are You a Software Update is a series of podcasts conceived and conducted by myself, Neja Berger, for the 16th edition of Tactics and Practice, the discursive program of the Aksioma Institute for Contemporary Art, curated this year by Nora Umurhu, Socrates Stamatatos, Janez Fakin Janša, and me. For more information on the context, participants, and partners involved, see the links in the description. This episode was recorded and edited by me. The music and audio post-production were taken care of by Gašper Torkar, and the project coordination by Marcela Ukretic. You're welcome to visit aksioma.org, where you'll find a wealth of free content. If you like what we do, you can also support us by making a donation. And that's it for today. See you next week. Greetings from Ljubljana and na svidenje.
Tactics and Practice Podcast.